Good evening. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're going to wait a few minutes as people enter the webinar. One more minute. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the 8th event of the Engaged Community Series, a joint initiative by the South Asian American Policy and Research Institute, or SAAPRI, and the South Asian American Justice Collaborative, or SAAJCO. My name is Sufyan Sohel, and I'll be moderating today's panel. We're thrilled to launch this year-long series, which brings critical conversations on civil rights, community well-being, and civic engagement directly to our communities. For those unfamiliar with the organizing partners, SAAPRI is a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization established in 2001. Through community-based research and strategic partnerships, SAAPRI drives impactful policy change at local, regional, and national levels. It is dedicated to empowering South Asian Americans by advancing data equity and ensuring our communities are accurately represented in public policy. SAAJCO is a civil rights and legal services nonprofit committed to advancing the civil and human rights of the South Asian diaspora in the United States. They do this through direct legal services, community engagement, and impact litigation. We'd also like to thank the Saba Foundation in Diaspora and Saba North America for their generous support of this series. The Engaged Community Series is designed to create space for South Asians and allies to access knowledge, exchange ideas, and connect with the resources that support justice and equity. Each month, we explore one of three core and interrelated themes: Know Your Rights, Unpacking Hate, and Civic Participation and Democracy. We do this through conversations with expert speakers, advocates, and community leaders. Before we dive in, a quick note: this session is being recorded and will be available afterward on both SAAPRI and SAAJCO's platforms. Please feel free to share your questions using the Q&A function. I'll try to get to as many as we can during or after the conversation. Our panel today is titled The Psychology of Hate. Our conversation is part of the Unpacking Hate theme of the Engaged Community Series. Because to challenge hate effectively, we need to understand where it comes from. We are living in a moment of sharp polarization, rising bias incidents, and increasing hate crimes targeting South Asians and so many other communities. But hate doesn't begin with violence. It begins in the mind, in fear, insecurity, stereotypes, and threats to belonging that gradually normalize discrimination that we see around us. So this panel serves as a bridge between science and community action. We'll explore what psychology teaches we'll explore what psychology teaches us about the roots of prejudice, how bias grows into hostility, and most importantly, what each of us can do to interrupt that path before hate takes hold. I'm so pleased to be joined by two leading voices in breaking this silence. Dr. Sapna Cheryan is a professor of psychology at the University of Washington. Her research investigates the role of cultural stereotypes in causing and perpetuating racial and gender disparities in U.S. society. She has published numerous articles on these topics. Her work has been cited widely in media outlets, including the New York Times, NPR, and the Washington Post. In 2012 to 2013, she was a visiting scholar at the Russell Sage Foundation in New York City, and in 2016 to 2017 was a Lenore Annenberg and Wallace Annenberg Fellow in Communication at the Center for Advanced Study in the Behavioral Sciences at Stanford University. She received her PhD from Stanford University. Dr. Stephen Spencer is the Robert K. and Dale Weary Chair in Social Psychology. He received his PhD in psychology from the University of Michigan, where he studied under Claude Steele and previously taught at the University of Waterloo for nearly 2 decades. His research examines how motivation and self-concept influence stereotyping and prejudice, particularly how threats to identity can shape bias, belonging, and performance. His work has been recognized with multiple awards, including the Gordon Allport Prize for his paper on latent ability, and has been published in leading journals such as the Journal of Personality and Social Psychology and Psychological Science. I just read a lot, so I appreciate you all still being with me here. We're going to switch over to questions to our esteemed panelists. I'd like to start off by framing hate as a continuum. Maybe something foundational. Many of us think of hate as something extreme or moral, something very separate from everyday life. But psychology suggests it exists on a broader continuum that begins with bias, stereotype, and even threats to our sense of self. And we see this every day in societies around us when people are feeling threatened and going after communities that they feel don't belong or that their own lives or livelihoods are being threatened. So before we jump into the specifics of your own work, I think it's important to start with the basics. What does it really mean to say that hate has psychological roots? Sapna, I'd love to start with you.
Yeah, so thank you so much for inviting me to join you. And yeah, this sounds like a really great opportunity to talk about some of the science behind a lot of the things that cause so many problems in our society. I'll just start by saying, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the field and mostly my research and also a lot of my students who've done this work. So it's definitely been a team effort, even though I'm the only person here. I have many, many students to thank for all the work that we've done in our lab over the last couple of decades. Okay, so your question was, why do stereotypes exist? Why do they persist? And this is a very big question. I'll try to keep it short and simple, and then, we can talk more if there's other things you want to follow up on. But the way that social psychologists see it is that sometimes stereotypes provide some way to um, shortcut or simplify our world in ways that can sometimes be very, very harmful, as we all know. So, the world is very complex. There's a lot going on, and stereotypes can form these little heuristics or shortcuts that we use when we don't have the ability or the resources or the time to do some kind of deep thinking or get to know people one-on-one. We kind of sometimes rely on these stereotypes. As you mentioned, they can also emerge out of a need to protect oneself. So they can be heightened in times of threat when we're feeling like, okay, there's, something's happening to me or my group. I need to kind of buckle down. Therefore, everyone else is kind of seen as an enemy. And when, stereotypes get challenged, they can also feel like they're challenging a very fundamental way that people see the world. So it can be hard to maintain. And then the only other thing I'll add is that another reason that stereotypes are so powerful is because they not only exist in people's heads, as I think you talked about, like they're in our minds, but psychologists have also studied, and a lot of other fields have studied how these stereotypes can also get embedded in our worlds. So they're embedded in, for example, social systems, the norms that we have, the way we even talk about different groups. And in some of our work, actually, we've even shown how stereotypes can be embedded in environments. So I'll just give you one example. So I have some research on, I do research on gender, and I also do research on race and Asian Americans. I'll talk a little bit about both probably today, but I'll start with a gender example. We have some research looking at stereotypes of different fields. So the people who do computer science versus engineering versus psychology versus English. And what we show is that sometimes those stereotypes are communicated through the environments that are associated with fields like computer science. So when people think of startup companies or computer labs, like back in the day when we had these computer labs, everybody would be working in computer labs to do their coding or whatever. And there's people will have these images of very like kind of stereotypically geeky or kind of masculine environments. And when people are exposed to those kinds of environments, what we found is that it can make many women feel like they don't belong in computer science as much. So these stereotypes can even get embedded outside of the head, outside of even if there's no people around, but you show people like what a startup looks like and it looks very stereotypically masculine. That's another way that stereotypes can get kind of baked into our society. So they're quite persistent and require they're not very easy to change. I'm sure we'll talk about that later.
Okay, thank you so much. Dr. Spencer, you've written about how threats to our self-image can make us more defensive or biased. How does that connect to what Dr. Am I saying it right, Cheryan?
Arian, yeah, you got it.
Justice described. Why might feeling personally threatened make us more likely to stereotype others?
Well, first of all, like Sapna, I want to thank all of my colleagues, and there's a lot of them over the years, a lot of former students, a lot of other professors and so forth. And Sapna and I actually have a very similar academic lineage. Her primary advisor was my secondary advisor. My primary advisor was, I'm sure, on your dissertation committee. And those two went from Michigan to Stanford. And, so I actually remember, I should tell this story at least a little bit. I remember when I was talking to my advisor, oh, there's this young woman who's in our program, Sapna, and she's just absolutely fabulous. And so I've heard that from when she very much started graduate school, and I've been a huge fan for a long time. We had her at Ohio State recently, had her a keynote for another grant that I had in Canada recently, and so I'm a huge fan. Saying that, let me also say that let me answer your question actually, which I really should do. My work has thought for a long time that it really matters. People actually, there's a real dark side, and it's a dark side of humanity, I would argue, that we like to look down upon other people at times. And particularly when we feel bad and when we feel threatened, we look down upon others as a way to feel better about ourselves. When I first started this work, that wasn't the dominant take on stereotyping and prejudice. It was that we need to make sense of the world, and our stereotypes about people are really no different than our stereotypes about tables and chairs. But I've always thought that there's something more fundamental and darker about our stereotypes about people, and that we often turn to um, diminishing views of others as a way to feel better about ourselves. And that's too easy for that to happen. And it is difficult to fight against. But as if we want to talk about solutions later, we can talk about some of them. There are real solutions as well. So I mean, I could talk about some of the specific studies we've done. One of the very first studies that I did with my colleague Steve Fine, we did these together. We were looking at what we would do is we gave people a test that was really hard. And we told them they either succeeded or they failed on the test. That lowered their self-esteem for a little bit, how they were feeling about how they did on the test. Then that predicted how much they stereotyped later on in the study. and then how much they were stereotyped and were prejudiced against the person in the study restored their self-esteem. And how they felt better about themselves. That's one of our classic studies that kind of showed this role of feeling bad leads you to stereotype. And if it's acceptable to stereotype that group, then you can feel better about yourself. And that's something I really want to emphasize. It's been in the field for a long time, and I think it's what we're seeing more in this day and age, that there's an aspect of stereotyping where it's a shared understanding with other people in the world. And when that dark side is a shared understanding that these people are bad, that creates an environment in which this hate makes you feel better about yourself type of pathway really thrives. And we saw that historically. We see that historically, I think, in times when the economy's bad, in times when people are feeling threat. And I think right now is a moment we feel threat from a pandemic that just happened. We feel threat from an economy in stagnation for most people in the economy. We feel, some people obviously feel a threat from increased immigration as they see it. All of those types of threats can lead to this stereotyping is okay and feed that pathway of looking down upon others as a way to feel better about yourself. And I think that's the moment that we're in now. We had hoped for a while, and it looked like there was hope that maybe that wasn't so dominant, but I think it was always there underneath. Scratch the surface a little bit, and it was there.
Thank you so much. Dr. Sapna, I want to go back to you. You're talking about gender stereotypes. I want to talk more about the cultural stereotypes you briefly mentioned. Sometimes those, even those that sound positive, actually create barriers.
Mhm.
For instance, you've shown how the image of a computer scientist as a socially awkward male genius may discourage women from entering tech fields, and how so-called positive stereotypes can still reinforce inequality. Can you talk a little bit, please, about what your research has revealed about these kinds of stereotypes, specifically like the model minority myth or gender-based expectations, and how they not only limit diversity, but also may create tensions?
Yeah, there's a lot more research on negative stereotypes than there is on positive stereotypes. And I started getting interested in positive stereotypes. So one thing to know about me, and I think a lot of social psychologists or many, is that my research is totally based on my own experiences. It used to be kind of taboo to say that, like people wouldn't want to, but it's, it's totally based on, both lines of my research are totally based on things that happened to me. I'm happy to go into more detail, but I remember like when I was an undergrad, people would just assume I was pre-med. I don't know how many people have had this experience, but they would just come up to me like, "Oh, you're pre-med," and I was never pre-med. I actually never wanted to go into medicine, and I would just get like increasingly annoyed by that question, like, why does everybody think well, I knew why they thought I was pre-med because it was like I was Indian in college in the 90s, like they just had certain stereotypes. But what was interesting to me is that how much it bothered me that people would make that assumption because it's seemingly a positive. It's not like, you want to be a doctor. That seems like a good thing. It seems like you could be, and so I was reflecting on that when I went to graduate school and started wondering whether positive stereotypes might be negative for the people that are confronted with them. And also, maybe even broader than that, as you mentioned, positive stereotypes might also have other negative consequences beyond just how the recipient of the positive stereotypes feel. But I'll start with the kind of recipient side and why positive stereotypes can be harmful. What we found, so we actually, you know, I get inspired by my own experiences. And then the cool thing about being a social psychologist, like I really love this field, is I'm so glad that I managed to find out that it existed in college, is that we then can put people in these exact scenarios and see how they respond. And we have these hypotheses about how they respond, and then we can test it and we can use numbers to empirically verify it. So we actually did studies where we took Asian American participants and we would put them in a scenario where they thought they were just like in a group working with other people on a series of academic tasks. And for half of our Asian American participants, we would have a white actor who was like working with us but supposedly in the group with the participant say, oh, you're Asian, why don't you take the math packet? You're good at math, so we would actually like inflict these positive stereotypes on our participants. And then of course at the end we would fully debrief them and tell them like that was part of the study, you know, let's talk about it. How are you feeling? And make sure everybody was okay with it. And in general, we didn't have any like negative responses to it. And people are actually mostly happy that we were studying this because people to this point hadn't really studied the negative effects of positive stereotypes on the recipients. Anyway, so what we ended up finding is that in a lot of studies that had this kind of setup, that Asian Americans respond negatively to positive. So they don't like it. They report that they feel more anger, more irritation. They don't like the person as much, and they see it as prejudice. And when we asked why, one of the reasons that came up empirically was that for Asian Americans, they felt they were being restricted, constrained in some way, kind of seen as depersonalized or kind of interchangeable with other group members. So you just feel like you're kind of losing your individuality, like you can't separate yourself. They're just kind of lumping you together with everybody else in your group, and that doesn't feel so good. And one other like really interesting tweak on this that we found with this set of studies was that this resistance to positive stereotypes is particularly salient and shows up for Asian Americans, so Asians who are born in the US or who are raised mostly in the US, and uh, for for cultural reasons, because in America, being an individual is something that we're all, socialized in. It's good to be unique and express yourself and be different from other people. So the positive stereotypes can be especially hurtful to Asian Americans. And what we found is like on average, less hurtful to Asians who are born outside of kind of more individualistic countries. Now, that doesn't mean it's not harmful to them. And it also doesn't mean that every American hates it. Like there's obviously going to be variability between these things. But it's one of the reasons they can be harmful is because they really come at odds with the way that Americans like to see themselves as being individuals. So that's one example of like why positive stereotypes can be harmful. There's a whole laundry list of other examples too. You alluded to one of them, which is that from a historical sociological perspective, positive stereotypes have been used as a wedge to keep groups of color apart. So like, this idea that like, well, Asian Americans have made it, so why can't like Black people make it, that kind of like rhetoric. You see it with like affirmative action, anti-affirmative action type of rhetoric. So it shows up all the time. And that can be extremely divisive. And we have a paper that has shown that different racial and ethnic groups are stereotyped in very different ways, with Asian Americans being stereotyped as both high on status, like competence, like, being good at math and relatively high income, so the model minority type of stuff, but also low on American identity, so being seen as more likely to be born outside the US and foreign, and maybe doesn't speak English well. And so a lot of times these kind of more positive stereotypes can also go along with these. The flip side of them is the more negative. And other groups might have totally different stereotypes. So for Black Americans might be stereotyped, for example, as lower on status, so less educated, more likely to be criminals, so those kinds of negative stereotypes. But then maybe stereotyped as like relatively American compared to like Asian Americans and Latinos and things like that. And these stereotypes, the fact that they differ between different groups, can be used to divide them, even if the stereotypes are positive. So that's just a small flavor. There's other, I didn't talk about gender at all, but there's a lot of research on like benevolent sexism, or thinking that women are wonderful, kind of putting them on a pedestal, and then how that can be used to actually undermine the chances that women are given. So women are so nurturing, like therefore they should be at home taking care of the kids and not having these intense careers. So there's many other types of ways that positive stereotypes can be negative. I'll also offer one more thing, which is that there are also sociologists who talk about the positive side of positive stereotypes, and that's something I think we can also, I think thinking when we think about our relationship to other groups, like there's a sociologist named Jennifer Lee, and she's written about this idea called stereotype promise. And this is the idea that sometimes teachers might apply these positive stereotypes and actually like give people more math, like Asian Americans more math, or get into the higher math group than they would have. And this, can have sometimes start a positive cycle too for Asian Americans. But the flip side of that can be very negative for the groups that are not granted that kind of competence. So there's also this, other line of research that other people have on the promise that you can have if you are stereotyped positively, but there's just a host of negative consequences that go along with it as well.
Thank you. A lot to think about. In a lot of my civil rights advocacy work, I talk about the balance between the perpetual foreigner as well as the model minority and where they clash at times and how those stereotypes are used to divide communities. I live in Chicago, right? And different communities are often pitted against each other for resources or access or whatnot. And oftentimes what people ignore is because of both of those, the perpetual foreigner and model minority myth, it neglects a huge portion of the community who may be undocumented, low income, and makes people assume that all of a certain community is a specific way and a certain status, and those who aren't are not included in the conversations when it comes to like meeting the needs of those communities. So I appreciate you uplifting that.
Yeah, I'm so glad you brought that up because that is a very important point that I did not say, which is that what stereotypes do is they homogenize and they make everybody assume that the whole group is the same. And then you end up missing, like, for example, with Asian Americans. Asian Americans are overrepresented among the poorest Americans, and people ignore that because they just think of Asian Americans as being wealthy. So that's another huge downside of positive stereotypes.
Thank you. Dr. Stephen, you work on stereotype threat shows how even subtle expectations can affect people's confidence, performance, and self-concept. Now, how do these kinds of stereotypes, whether they're framed as praise or pressure, shape how we internalize success or failure? And how might that internal pressure connect to broader social tensions between different groups?
Oh, well, that's a very good question. I mean, the idea behind stereotype or social identity threat that lots of people can feel in a lot of different situations is in a context, you have this stereotype that acts like a threat that's in the air. It's like an accusation, but you're not sure where it's going to happen or when it's going to happen. It creates this sense of anticipation of potential mistreatment or potential mistreatment based on the stereotype. And that's something extra that you have to deal with in those situations. It can undermine performance because when you're trying to, let's say, work on a test, you have those other thoughts that intrusively come into your mind. And you have to try and hold those away. And as you hold those away, the more they come back. It's actually one of the things we know more generally. Trying not to think about something doesn't work. Um, you end up thinking about it more. And that threat in the air can disrupt performance in that very way. And it's part of the reason that positive stereotypes can create the same type of problems. Because if you're worried about being stereotyped, you're just at a level that it could happen here. It's something I have to think about. It really doesn't matter if it's positive or negative. If it's that intrusive thought, it's gonna impair your ability to focus on what you need to focus on at that moment. Um, so this is the stereotype, though, is going to be very context dependent. You're going to see it in some context more than others. And that means what we really need is we need context where people have cues to and they can feel a sense of safety. So they're not worrying about that. That threat isn't in the air. And so as we look to a way forward, it's really creating environments where those accusations, those concerns are removed from the situation. And if you can remove those from the situation, you see that groups actually do way better when you do that. And so it is something it's not just because you're stereotyped, you have it. It's you're stereotyped that will come up in some situations more than others, in places where you have to worry that there could be somebody who's stereotyping you more than others. And I think one of the most pernicious parts of it is it actually affects people who care the most. One of the situations where it really matters is if this is your thing and this is where you stake your identity. in this domain, then all of a sudden those pressures are worse. My advisor, Claude Steele, who developed these ideas, and I was fortunate enough to work with him on him. He calls it the vanguard hypothesis. And what he means by the vanguard hypothesis is that those who are at the forefront, who are the leaders, who are really achieving well, they feel it the most. Um, and and that really makes it hard to become invested in those domains that you care about because you have that extra pressure that other people don't have.
Really appreciate that. You both have shared some great things about bias and invisibility and shaping belonging on the personal level. But when those feelings go unaddressed and the stereotypes and insecurities build across groups, I've noticed that they spill into something larger, right? Resentment, fear, even open hostility. Psychology shows that prejudice doesn't just emerge overnight. It grows from smaller, often invisible processes. Can you both speak to what research tells us about how those everyday biases, when left unchecked, can evolve into more open hostility or scapegoating? One example I think about a lot is like September 11th or COVID. South Asians and other Asian Americans faced this huge surge in hate incidents. I just read this week anti-Muslim posts on X about Zohran Mamdani increased by more than 450%, right? A lot of this is like normalized rhetoric around certain communities that used against other communities would not be acceptable, but we've normalized it as society as some of it too. So how does psychology help explain why fear and uncertainty so often translate into targeting these specific groups? Dr. Stephen, I'll start with you, please.
Well, this is something that I'm actually trying to study at the moment. So I'll tell you about the ideas, and I'll tell you about the history in the field, and what I think is going on, and hopefully we'll have more evidence over time. I think I've focused on in my own work that people often stereotype others to feel better about themselves. But I think there's another aspect to stereotyping, another basic motivation is that they want to have a community that they connect with. And what we've known from the past is that some people want to connect with a community that sees other people as negative, that wants to blame people, that wants to understand a world that's hard to understand in a very particular way. And so I think there's a connection between the growth in extreme beliefs, the growth in belief in conspiracy theories, and the growth in communities that support those sorts of beliefs. And those are exactly the communities that to fit in and feel you're a part of those communities, you apply stereotypes against different groups. And so I think that need to be part of a community, when the community takes a certain shape, can really drive taking stereotypings to a different level where it's actually hate. Now, historically in the field, once upon a time, um, um, research on stereotyping focused on what happened in World War II. And there was a whole line of research on what was called the authoritarian personality. And that research tried to make the case um, that this basic need to be part of a group, and there were several lines that came off of it, was something that was driving the hatred that you saw in Germany during World War II. And it's not what we see is the rise in that sort of almost fascistic right-wing hatred now. And I think there is something to that. We have a shared view, and I'm not going to challenge that. I'm going to increase it, that shared view, and that sense that other people believe what I believe, and that's driving a lot of the current um, moving from just, I don't like that group, to I want to hurt them, and it would be good to hurt them, and the type of things you were talking about. And I do think that the internet is particularly set up as a context to accelerate those types of beliefs. And there isn't the same sorts of checks that you have on those beliefs in the internet because you have little bubbles. Whereas if you have communities, there's other checks. Other people can say, now, come on, that's awful. But nobody says that in the bubbles. So that's what I think is going on. And I'm trying to study this in various different ways, but it's not always easy. And it's where I would like to go in the research. It's historically it's there. The arguments are, but they weren't really ever tested very well. And I think that's one of the areas where we really have to step up and do more research.
I appreciate that. I think a lot about the algorithms of my social media and like how very singular the views that I'm exposed to also, and having to take a step back and be like, what am I not hearing? What am I not reading? Because it tends to be very affirmative to like my thoughts, right? Because I keep liking, I keep saving, I keep
Mhm.
sharing, and it's all where I think they're right views, but also they're not all of the views that are out there.
Mhm.
Yeah. And you're not challenged if by these sorts of things. And I think it's good to be challenged. But it isn't. And when you're not challenged, these darker views can take hold and can strengthen.
Thank you. Dr. Sapna?
Yeah, I'll add to that. I thought that was a great answer. Totally agree. The one layer I'll add to that that I was thinking about is also the role of norms. And this actually plays out to just what you were both talking about with algorithms too. Like, sometimes people have certain thoughts or ideas, but they don't act on them because the norms in society say we don't do this stuff, and people are very um, oriented to norms. Like that's one of the we're very social creatures. That's one of the, psychology 101 type of things. We're extremely social and we're oriented to finding a sense of belonging in a community. And if that community has certain norms and practices and standards, we absorb those very quickly. Anybody who's traveled, to a different country knows this immediately. Like you land and you're immediately like, what are the norms here? What do people do how do they board the train? What do they eat? We're very sensitive to those things. And when we have a society where the norms are like the administration is using speech that's kind of violent and hateful, and guns are everywhere. And, it just allows people to take kind of maybe some of their darker thoughts and convert that into violence and hate speech and other things because that's what they feel like is the way the society's going. That's what they feel like is okay. And another, I guess, thing I'll add to this is, um, I think this effort to to think about, okay, well, how can we kind of fix society of its ills? Let's go to what people are thinking and feeling. I think that's definitely one route, but what we know from social psychology is there's like a pretty weak correlation between people's attitudes and then what they actually do. It's kind of a well-known psychological phenomenon that attitudes and behaviors are not super well correlated, and behaviors are really can really be shaped by the norms. Even if you don't agree with the norms, oftentimes you're acting in accordance with them. It's why America sometimes feels like it's like you're like, how can these same people go from like being so pro gay marriage to then being so white supremacist, and then, and what's happening is the culture is shifting and people will shift when the culture shifts. And so, right now we might be in a time when it seems like, to me at least, like kind of what I would call like kind of stereotypically masculine, aggressive rhetoric is seen as normalized. And I think it allows a lot of this hate stuff to just emerge and keep going.
Appreciate that. But also context, right? Like, and you've written that a lot of these things emerge depending on when context, certain conditions make them flare up even more.
Mhm.
Um, what would you say are some of those conditions and how they relate to the moments of social or political stress when these sorts of hate crimes arise, right? Like, I think about Charlie Kirk a lot and like how so many people have been villainized for just repeating his statements and condemned and all that. And I think, but then those same First Amendment challenges have been so very different, and people have been penalized for speaking up, not speaking up, et cetera, et cetera. And it's really dependent on the context in which they're speaking out, right? So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, is this one for me or do you want
Yeah.
okay, yeah. I mean, I think we've touched on some of those things. So like feelings of threat when people feel like they're threatened, their group is threatened, their country is threatened. A lot of times it's based on inaccurate information, but those feelings of threat can really be, set the context. I think we talked about algorithms, social media, like echo chambers. That's another context that I think can create these really kind of, polarized communities where we feel like it's us against them, even when, before we might have interacted across these lines a lot more easily. And then I think there's always we talk about hate, but there's some research that shows that um, something that may be even more common is like in-group love, and that in-group love can then translate into doing biased and negative things against others. So the desire to feel a sense of community, feel a sense of belonging, have pride in one's group, sometimes that can spill over into behaviors that are discriminatory or negative towards other groups as well. So yeah, so those are just examples of conditions. I don't know, Steve, if you want to add any others that you can think of.
Well, I mean, I do think historically, economic,
Mhm.
broad societal economic, I think also probably income disparity.
Mhm.
Because one of the things we know as social psychologists, you can stay at the same place, but if you feel like you're falling behind and you're comparing to other people, that's very threatening. And so increases in income disparity that we've seen are probably driving this as well. Both the economy not doing great, kind of stagnating, especially for lots of people, together with the sense that other people are excelling, is probably part of it. I do think the basic threat of thinking about, your own potential demise during a pandemic can be a big part of it. Um, and I do think that some leaders actually purposely try to paint the world as very threatening.
Mhm.
Um, and if you hear it over and over again, what a mess the world is. I mean, you're from Chicago. The characterization of Chicago is just being a hellhole, I think is the way it's been just, and it's threatening and, you can't possibly live there and so forth. And yet when I go to Chicago, it's a beautiful place in lots of many ways. Lots of things can be characterized in many ways, but I think many things have been characterized to create a threatening image of the world. And so I think I think that's increased just the threatening view of the world. And I do think there's a sense that's important with the hate is one of the checks I think has traditionally been in society, in American society, I should say, that there are people who can call upon their expertise, call upon the roles they play in society to put checks on some of these things. But I also think one of the things that's happened in the last few years is expertise, qualifications, what you know about, um, as a check on beliefs that is has weakened substantially. And I do think in addition to threat, you can't listen to these sorts of people. And there's been lots of rhetoric about not listening to people who might provide a check on hate, is a part of the process as well. Um, and why it's emerged. So, I mean, and that includes, I think, everything from academics like us, but it also includes things like the courts, and certainly, unfortunately, organizations like those who are sponsoring this, they don't have the influence that they used to.
Agreed. Thank you both. You've been so great at helping us unpack how bias and insecurity escalates into prejudice or even hostility, and how these dynamics have impacted South Asian, and so many other communities. I want to spend the last portion of our conversation talking about some solutions. If hate begins in the mind and in our social environments, what does psychology tell us about how to interrupt those patterns and hopefully build something more inclusive instead? Dr. Sapna, much of your work looks at how the environments we create, whether it be classrooms, workplaces, social media spaces, they send signals about who belongs and who doesn't. And we've touched upon a lot of those in our conversation. What kind of environments or cultural changes have you found actually help reduce bias and help make people feel more seen?
Yeah. I mean, part of my goal getting into social psychology was really not only like the science behind why these disparities exist, but also what concrete things we can do to actually change them. So I've been really focused on that throughout my career. And I'll talk about my gender work first. In that work, what we found is so what I'm interested in is understanding why women are underrepresented in fields like computer science and engineering. In countries like the US, it's not a global phenomenon. It's in many countries, but not everywhere, which is also something interesting that we could talk about if you'd like. But in the US, why do women and girls continue to be underrepresented in these fields? And what can we do to change it? And what we found is that the image of these fields is a big factor, as we talked about earlier. But there's many ways that you can change the image of the field, and computer science is actually a really great example because it has changed. Its image has changed over time. I mean, it's a pretty new field, but when it first came on the scene, in the 50s, um, it was seen as kind of a more feminine field. It was seen as something that people who could, who were kind of like secretarial would do is, punch cards and things like that. And so women were the programmers back then. And so it had a reputation for being a field that women could do and could do well. And then it became masculinized as it increased in status, increased in pay. And then we saw kind of the computer nerd image emerge, and then that got really reinforced by the media. So in the 80s and 90s, films like Revenge of the Nerds or Real Genius. And then now it has kind of a different image. I've been kind of reflecting on how the image of tech has changed now. So now it's not so much like these, nerds working in their garage, who drop, just like play video games and stuff like that. But it's gotten more of a like, lots of money, people who maybe are more like socially conservative, um, maybe a little bit more hostile, things like that. So, it's an example of how historical trends and what's going on in the world can kind of change these images. But you can also like purposefully change them in a small, like in your own area. So, for example, thinking about who's in the media. So is there an example of a computer scientist who doesn't fit that image? In the media, it's kind of hard to think of that. But like in medicine, when ER first came out and started showing all these different images of what it meant to be a doctor, that actually helped to diversify the field of medicine, both racially and in other ways too. So using the media can be one way, changing, pe exposing people to these fields, for example, like I talked about the environments that are associated with these fields, or like taking classes in these fields. So getting exposure to groups or to fields or other things that are stereotypes, we can get a more accurate image of what it's actually like and not just rely on their stereotypes. So then thinking about like who's propped up as role models is another way to so who are the teachers, who's in government right now, who represents that group, who's on the posters, who's on the magazine covers, all the representation that really of course matters as well. So those things can be used to change stereotypes.
Thank you. That was so helpful. Dr. Stephen, your research on self-affirmation and belonging intervention shows that even small psychological shifts can make a big difference. What are some ways communities or organizations can use those insights to build resilience and connection across groups?
Well, I'm going to deviate just a little bit and not answer that quite so directly because I want to focus on another really important thing that social psychology has demonstrated. Actually, it's one of our oldest findings, and I think one of our proudest moments. And that is In 1954, there was a social science brief that was brought forward largely by social psychologists that argued that you needed to desegregate schools to have equality. And that research is based on a line that basically shows that one of the most potent ways to create good environments and to reduce prejudice and stereotyping is for people to get to know each other. It's called the contact hypothesis in the field, but it basically means that you go out and you get to know people who aren't like you. And it's been demonstrated over and over again that it's a super powerful way. It's a super powerful way to reduce stereotyping and prejudice. And I think, as we were talking about the internet, one of the big problems is you don't get to know people not like you. It segregates society. And desegregation really reduces stereotyping and prejudice. So there are even conditions, though, that make that sort of contact between people work really well. And that really is creating environments where people are equal status, where they appreciate one another, where they recognize that the humanity of the other people involved. If you have those sorts of settings and creating more of them, I think one of the solutions for society is actually doing that more. Now, I think related to that is I think it's particularly helpful if white male stodgy people like me recognize that even they at times feel some of these same things that other people have on a more chronic basis and recognize what that must be like. And that is really a responsibility for those of us who have privilege to understand what it's like to be in somebody else's skin. And that happens by talking with them, getting to know them, and that's really fundamental and important. And that has to happen more. So really creating an environment that is really begins with those who have the benefits of that environment, recognizing that and wanting that and the norms being developed that they want that for other people as well. They want an environment where you're not constantly worried about, are people going to stereotype me? Where you're not worried about, okay, is somebody going to potentially hurt me here? Is somebody going to say something really mean-spirited? We've all been in some situation where we felt that at a time or another, but that's rare for people like me. And we have to know that that really is an impediment for people where it isn't rare to be in those types of environments. So how do we create environments where people can focus on what the environment's about? So if it's school, how they can focus on school rather than focus on these other issues. So when we do self-affirmation, I argue self-affirmation works in school settings because it tells people that what you care about, we care about. And that changes the environment for somebody who has to face stereotyping. Those things you value and really matter to you, we value them, and therefore we value you. And that's why those types of environments work. So um, I don't think self-affirmation works because you build up resiliency and you can cope with all of this. I really think the solution is changing the environments rather than papering it over with band-aids and giving people ways to fight, situations that are really, really hard. The situation needs to change, not the people need to adapt to it.
Thank you for that. I want to get to a couple of the questions that our audience has submitted. Two are very closely aligned. And, I think a lot about, I'm a child of Indian immigrants, and a lot of my parents' generation, and I see it trickle into my own, have brought together classicism, colorism, casteism, economic disparities, a lot of the things that you all talked about. And the two of the questions here touch upon both about that biases are deeply ingrained, as well as uh, how do you explain to an older generation that many behaviors have deep roots not in society, but in how our brains are wired? So they're curious to, are our brains still elastic enough later on in life, specifically for older generations, to unlearn or overcome these biases? I say yes, but you two are the experts.
Yes, I think we would agree. Yes, it's never too late to make change. And actually, I was gonna just say one of the things that we're researching currently in our lab, and actually we have, fortunately, this grant got terminated, so we've slowed down a little bit, but I'm still super interested in it. Is we've been talking about like the bias that is is in, South Asians face in American society, but we've also gotten very interested recently in the way that Asian Americans can also be uh, perpetrating biases against other groups of color. So, like anti-Blackness, for example. And so we've been thinking a lot in our lab of, what are the ways that we can intervene? And one of the things that comes up when we talk to our Asian American participants a lot is the older generation. Like, how can we talk to our elders about some of their views and get them to change? And I know we were running out of time, so I'll just give you one little tidbit that I think is interesting. One of the things that we noticed is that a lot of the education around anti-racism is framed in terms of like white supremacy, so why white supremacy is bad and how to combat it. And that's a very useful message and true. We need to combat white supremacy, but that doesn't really speak to non-Black people of color. I mean, it speaks to us in the sense that we're the victims of white supremacy as well, but it might actually create a barrier for us to sometimes recognize the ways in which we can also perpetuate hate. And so we started thinking about if we can change the framing, the anti-racism framing from trying to combat white supremacy to trying to address anti-Blackness, then it allows for a different conversation among Asian Americans, where Asian Americans can then start to recognize some of the things that you were just talking about, like colorism, and the ways that anti-Blackness shows up in our own communities. And so, I'm trying to think about like all this anti-racism work that has been done. It's been done for white people, rightly so. But we also need a parallel track where we need to think about how we can think about anti-racism that exists in our own communities and what is the language we need? How can we talk to our elders and ourselves about where the places that shows up? So anyway, so yes, keep doing the work. It's I think even little flashes of knowledge like that sometimes can just be enough to get people to see something differently and cause them to change something.
Thank you, Dr. Stephen.
I guess I would just say, I think all the processes we talk about breaking down prejudice and stereotyping can work for older people as well. I do think, there are a couple things as people get older. Some of them take a lot of cognitive work, and that is diminished slightly as you get older. And also, especially one of the things that's good that people do is they try to inhibit stereotyping. And that's harder when you're older. So I think when you see that, some of what you see in older people is just less inhibition of what we're better at inhibiting. So some graciousness to know that everybody has challenges, including older people, is true. And some of that then can be, okay, yeah, you didn't inhibit that. You should. And that's actually creates teachable moments, because I actually think that's how norms can often be really made clear. That we talked about a check, and that's one of the checks that's really important. It's when one of the real problems sometimes is that when people violate norms, if there isn't, if you don't bring in checks on those norms, then the norms aren't as clear as they might be otherwise. So actually confronting and dealing with prejudice as you see it, when it isn't inhibited, can actually serve the function of solidifying the norms.
I really appreciate that. My last question. First, a couple people have asked for me to summarize some of the takeaway points from this conversation. So I'm going to say what I learned, and then what I would love to do is just invite you both to say if there's one small shift in mindset, behavior, or how we talk about identity that we wish that you wish that we would all make after this conversation that would be so helpful. So the takeaways from my understanding of the conversation was hate is learned, which means that it can be unlearned. Stereotypes, positive or negative, can limit everyone. Identity threat fuels defensiveness and bias. And bias grows quietly, then can explode in moments of crisis, as we saw with the pandemic, as we see now. Environments can either reinforce or dismantle hate. Representation and storytelling are acts of resistance, an act of changing some of those biases. So it takes small shifts to make the big changes in how we think about some of these, and that our path forward is through empathy, education, and engaging with people who may be different than us.
Yeah.
Yeah, that was really good. I'll just add one thing, which I think was kind of maybe implicit in a lot of the remarks, which is if the, think about cleaning up your own environment. Sometimes these things feel so hard. Like, what am I going to do? Like, I have to make dinner. I have to, but think about like, what do you control? So maybe you control like your little work team, or you control your kids, daycare or whatever. So what can you do, or your community, like maybe you can volunteer, but what's one thing you can do to just clean up the norms, set, positive norms. And so, sometimes it can be very overwhelming, but try to start small. If we all do that, if we all clean up what we have, then we will make huge change.
Great. Thank you.
And I would just echo that. I was going to say one of the simple things you can do is get to know somebody who isn't like you. Take some time, get to know somebody who isn't like you, and really appreciate their humanity as you do that. Is one of the simple things you can do. And challenge yourself to think about things in different ways. Realize that one of the roots of the problems is trying to think about things too much in the same way can create demonization of all kinds of people in different ways. And that ultimately is what allows hate to be expressed when you demonize people and see them as not fully human.
Thank you both so much, Dr. Spencer, Dr. Cheryan. So grateful to have you both here with us tonight. This conversation was incredible, and we hope this was insightful and engaging for all of you today. SAAPRI is conducting a live survey to better understand the experiences of South Asian immigrants. We will be emailing that out, but I've also dropped it in the chat. And our next panel coming up on December 4th. There's an Eventbrite link, which I'm also throwing in the chat. We'll also be compiling notes and key takeaways from the panel and sharing them as a resource with all of you. So please stay tuned for that in the coming weeks. I thank you again for being here and for being part of these really important conversations. And we look forward to seeing you at the next session. Thank you.